disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
A boss ain't nothing but a thief on a time loan. 128-bit war, you play Nintendo. On some shooter, so put the bridge down and feed us to the killer bees. We get what we deserve, like bury me with my MP3s. Write my manifesto in 72 DPI. Life's just a game, you got cheated, never learned. I write these songs for every bridge that ain't been burned, for every cop car that ain't.
Welcome to This Is America, January 7th, 2021. On today's episode, first we bring you an audio report from a New Year's Eve noise demonstration in so-called Tucson, Arizona, where in the past year, at least 10 people have died in the local jail. People rallied outside of the facility, playing music, making noise, shooting fireworks, and standing in solidarity with those inside. We then speak with our legal correspondent and break down the news that the FBI was embedded within the George Floyd protests in so-called Portland, Oregon throughout 2020 and early 2021. We talk about what this news means and how it fits into a larger pattern of repression. We then switch to our discussion, where we look back on the one-year anniversary of the attempted January 6th coup in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about what has and hasn't changed, how both the far-right and the GOP have shifted, and why the possibilities for far-right violence are higher than ever. All this and more, but first, let's get to the news. In the midst of the Great Resignation, workers are walking off the job and organizing sick-out actions in the face of the Omicron surge and the push by both corporate parties to force workers back into the workforce and students back into schools, as inflation grows and supply chains falter. In Buffalo, New York, newly unionized workers at Starbucks have walked off the job for several days in protest of working conditions. In Portland, Maine, workers at a pizzeria walked off their jobs after multiple calls for better workplace safety. In Chicago, schools have shut down classes for over 340,000 students after teachers demanded a return to online instruction. According to one report, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the district have branded the walkout an illegal work stoppage for which teachers' pay will be docked. The union has accused the mayor and officials of locking out teachers by freezing their online platforms, preventing a return to remote learning. The White House appeared to side with the district, with Biden's press secretary saying on Wednesday and Thursday that it will continue to make the case for public schools to be kept open, including in Chicago. Meanwhile, in San Francisco and Oakland, teachers have also organized sick-out actions. These organized actions are part of a much larger wave in response to the spread of the coronavirus variant. Already, according to one education tracker, 4,783 schools across the U.S. have been forced to begin the semester remotely. In Portland, for instance, two of the city's largest high school buildings were closed on Friday, and students will be given online assignments to complete by themselves due to staff shortages. In New York, around 300,000 students did not show up to school on Monday as classes resumed after the winter break, with many parents keeping their children home. Both corporate parties have been clear that their push to reopen is based on a desire to protect the economy and supply chains from disruption. Such a policy has now led to over 800,000 deaths, a mass spike in infections, and no end in sight for the pandemic. Despite attempting to align themselves within the culture war around the benefits of everything from masks to taking horse medicine, both Republicans and Democrats have been united in their defense of ruling class economic interests over the health and well-being of the working class. Such policies have resulted in an embrace of mass death. Meanwhile, pipeline protesters in Chester County, Pennsylvania locked themselves down to disrupt the construction of the Mariner East pipeline. In Boynton Beach, Florida, over 1,000 protesters and community members gathered to honor the life of Stanley Davis Jr., a 13-year-old boy on a dirt bike who was killed during a traffic stop by police. Demonstrators rode various vehicles, including road bikes and normal bicycles, and held signs demanding justice for Stanley, known to many as SJ. The rally began from the gas station where SJ last filled up his dirt bike, heading down the route he was chased, until reaching the destination where he crashed and sadly was killed by law enforcement. And also in Florida, over a dozen prisoners at the Taylor Correctional Institution went on strike against slavery and forced labor. A flyer circulated by inmates read, "This means war. We are responding. Year after year, they continue to fail to do anything comprehensive to fix or undo the atrocities and destruction caused by their criminal and inhumane legislation. Check out a full report linked in our show notes. And now for some upcoming events. On Saturday, January 8th, in Chicago, there is a counter-mobilization against the neo-Nazi Patriot Front group, which is supposedly going to show up at the March for Life rally. On the same day in Los Angeles, there's an anarchist book fair, and also on the same day at the Cambridge Community Center from 1 to 8 p.m. in Massachusetts, there's a really free market with zine tables, bands, and lots more. And finally, if you value What's Going Down as a revolutionary autonomous media resource in times of crisis and you want to see us grow into the new year, please go to itsgoingdown.org/shop, sign up to donate monthly, give us a one-time donation through the site or on Bitcoin. Currently, we are on the tail end of a fundraiser. We only have a couple $100 left to fundraise, so please go to itsgoingdown.org and sign up to donate monthly or give us a one-time donation. You can also subscribe to our podcast on multiple platforms, follow our RSS feed, listen to us on the radio, follow us on social media, tell a friend about us, and also if you enjoy this show and want to check out more anarchist content, go to the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network to find more programs. That's going to do it for us. As always, enjoy the interviews and the discussion, and we will see you soon.
On New Year's Eve in Tucson, Arizona, about 50 people brought the party to those locked inside the Pima County Jail, hoping to honor the memory of the 10 lives lost in the jail this year. Many of those present were family members of those who died inside the jail, and as their cries echoed off the cinder block walls of this monument to death and domination, people languishing inside flipped their cell lights on and off and banged on their windows to let those outside know they were heard. Family members and their supporters shot off fireworks and honked their horns while the kids banged on trash cans outside the jail. The crowd held its ground when the sheriffs arrived 5 cars deep, pulling up onto the sidewalk and forming a line in front of the building. They were taunted and laughed at until they left. The jail was built to grind away at human life, and its death drive is only subverted, even if only momentarily, by expressions of creativity, joy, and rebellion by those inside and outside its walls. In memory of those who died in the jail this year, here's to a raucous and joyful 2022.
My name's Frances Guzman. I'm the mother of Cruz Patino Jr. III. My son passed away in Pima County Jail, but was found unresponsive in his cell. I'm here because I don't want no other mothers going through what I'm going through, and I don't buy it one bit that my son passed from natural causes. I mean, the people that work here, they're not dealing with animals and they're not dealing with monsters. They're dealing with human beings. I want change. My son had a heart of gold. He's a very caring and loving kid. He is a very caring and loving kid.
Your spirit home.
Single shot from the top floor, do his top roll. All we know is getting the block floor, breaking his balls, cowboys, niggas are outlaws.
Just to just get some justice for our son CJ, man. You know, nobody deserves to die like that, man. I really think there was negligence involved with that, man. And just there was wrongful death, man. I mean, it was very tragic. I mean,
anything you want to say about CJ? Anything you want to remember about him tonight?
Just rest in peace. He was a good kid, man. He had his whole life in front of him, man, ahead of him, and just everybody messes up, man. He was a good kid, man. Just rest in peace, man. I hope these guys still alive, man.
The main goal here is to make some kind of change within the Pima County jail itself. There's been too many inmate deaths and nothing's have gotten done about it. I hope that at least what we're doing out here, it shows our elected leaders, our local representatives and stuff like that, that there is something going on here, whether it be internal or just within the inmates itself. Something needs to happen in order for change to get done here. I don't know, we want answers, we want, questions to be answered, and it feels like we're being ignored. It feels like none of them are being answered, and it feels like it's just another brown or black individual gone without a voice. And in this country, it's always been statistically and history-wise speaking that black and, Mexican American or Hispanic descent always get the worst out of anybody else. Not that white individuals don't, but whatever the circumstances more has to be is that there needs to be a transparent internal review within the Pima County Justice itself.
Yeah, I think it's important to me to keep coming out, organizing, or just showing support online however I can to demos like this especially, because we're not in the shoes of the victims or the families. And to most people, it's just a death. To the police and the system that killed them, they're just a death that is also justified to them because they made mistakes like everyone else. But to the family and friends, it was their child, their parent, partner, friend, etc. And noise demos and showing out in front of the police, and the people who did this, I think is a really good way of showing support and helping them as much as you can. This is the first year that they're having to live or go through the holidays, especially, without whoever passed away. And I just think about that a lot when showing up to these things, that it's not just a death, like these are family members and people that had lives and of course really matter, and especially the families are having to go through their daily life without somebody very important to them now. And then for the victims, they don't get any opportunity to say how they feel or speak for themselves anymore because it was taken away from them. The authoritarians and discriminatory policies that put us in this situation are never going to stop without movements like this that make them realize what they've done to real people and put it right in front of their faces and notice other humans outside of how they perceive them and their actions as mistakes or justified or whatever that is. So yeah, I think marches and street actions and all demos like that are very important, but especially these that involve vigils and target helping the families and supporting them through this time the most.
CJ, he was a very young kid, and that's the part that bothers me. And I think a lot of people most is that these kids that are dying, it's a little bit of both old, elderly, and younger individuals. But these past three cases have been fresh or young individuals, and they haven't had a life to start out with. Most of them had kids that they're leaving behind that will never get to know their dad, or they didn't even get to start a family. And just because they're in a bad position in life where they had to be confined within these walls, doesn't deserve, for them to not have their family get any answers on how they passed away or what was the cause. CJ did have a big heart, and I know that he loved his friends and family. And if there is an afterlife and he is watching down, I sure do hope that he knows that his family is coming to his time of need and his support,
Alright, we're joined here again today with our legal correspondent. We're going to be talking about an article that came out in the New York Times about the FBI embedding themselves within the ongoing protest between 2020, when things really kicked off. The federal troops were on the ground, people were being disappeared. We had the Wall of Moms come out, and supposedly they were there from that time in mid-2020 all the way up to 2021, and they were sort of mixed in with the protesters, and this led to various charges being filed, various cases being developed. We're going to talk about what this means. This article came out and a lot of people were sharing it. I think for a lot of new folks, this might have come to a shock. I feel like a lot of people are not shocked about this at all, though. But let's just get your initial take on reading about this, about the FBI being on the streets of Portland during this time. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, my initial thought was that I wasn't horribly surprised based on the overall federal response that we saw in Portland and nationally, that they would be taking this step. And I think it reflects just how intensely they perceived the size and the duration and the energy of the uprisings and the struggles that were going on in Portland at the time, and how seriously they took that they were, willing to throw, pretty considerable resources at it. For, reading through the article, what's really striking is that, like, for what really amounts to just, like, property damage and vandalism, I think, the former FBI agent Mike German made the comment that, like, they're going after this for vandalism. But, they clearly take that extremely seriously, and they saw this as a significant threat that needed to be addressed from, the highest levels.
It's interesting, like, if you read the article, they kind of poke some of the FBI people, and the FBI says, like, well, we were out there because we got credible threats, and the credible threats are violent in nature. But like you said, I mean, in reality, first of all, the major violence came either from right-wing vigilantes coming into the protest, either injuring people or in some select cases killing them. I believe there was over at least like 14 or at least over a dozen people that were murdered by far-right vigilantes during the course of the uprising, and also the National Guard, and also the police and federal troops themselves. I mean, there was just another article that came out that they were firing expired tear gas over all these months, and just the horrific health effects that had on people, not to mention people being, like, shot in the head with tear gas canisters and other projectiles and munitions. I mean, those were serious violence, not people burning a dumpster or spray painting ACAB on a wooden plank or breaking a window. I mean, the federal building where most of the protests happened were pretty boarded off and covered with like fences and boards, and that's where most of the back and forth between law enforcement happened. I mean, I think, and we'll talk about this probably later too, but I think it's also important to highlight just the different dynamics with the far right. Like, for instance, in the Portland area, there was a big expose that came out in late 2020 where it showed a lot of the folks that ended up kind of the same scene that kind of went to the Capitol on January 6th. You know, they were organizing and talking with each other in various Facebook groups, talking about assassinating local politicians and killing activists and stuff. But somehow those threats to the FBI are taken, it seems like, not as seriously as, you know, these protests that have mild property destruction. And of course, I think the major thing here is they don't want this to spread and they don't want it to get out of control. And that's where they spend most of their energy. But that also means that really all this rhetoric about stopping violence is really not what's going on.
Right. And I think the article made a similar point that, like, the FBI did not, at least as far as we know at this point, did not have these sorts of undercover, secretive surveillance teams embedded within the protest that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. There were no, undercover FBI agents standing shoulder to shoulder with the Proud Boys as they breached the Capitol and, killed Capitol police officers and, tried to assassinate politicians. And we know that they had intelligence beforehand about, maybe not the exact, scope of what was going to happen, but the general nature of, what people were thinking about, what people were intending. The rhetoric coming out of the far right is consistently much more violent and much more, threatening, deadly personal violence, than anything coming out of the left. But, I also want to be careful that we don't underplay, what was going on in Portland, either. That there was, a very concerted struggle going on there. And a lot of the so-called crime that the feds were responding to was, little more than vandalism, but there was arson going on as well. There was, I believe the police union building, was set on fire. Molotov cocktails were being thrown. Other acts of, arson and attempted arson going on. And so I don't think we do ourselves a real service if we pretend that it was all just like sort of petty vandalism. But there is still a sort of degree of scope between, like, an empty building on fire versus, right-wingers that are threatening to publicly execute politicians.
To me, I just think that they're more worried about everything spreading and things like, all these different groups popping up that are getting involved in the demonstrations. I mean, they see that and they get freaked out, and I think they just want to shut that stuff down as much as possible.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
And I mean, even George Floyd's family, when they did their famous press conference after I think Derek Chauvin was found guilty, they said, thanks to Portland for holding it down in the streets for all those months. That's one of the reasons we got this.
Right.
But I mean, moreover, it was just this like really shining beacon of resistance to the rest of the country. And I don't know, it's interesting too, because the further you get in the article, one of the last things the FBI person who was like the person, it seems like, in charge of that region, it looks like they're no longer in that position, but they said, like, we were getting a lot of pressure to basically clamp down and do something about these protests, which, interestingly enough, I mean, from what we were covering, it seemed like the only time that it really dissipated was when the fires happened and everybody switched to mutual aid. Plus, you couldn't really breathe outside.
Right.
And then, after that, the protests kind of started back up, but they were just, by that point, it was pretty clear that things had, I don't want to say run their course, but, just that, things had shifted. But also, there was a big struggle around, I believe it's called the Red House, where people were barricading entire neighborhoods, stopping this eviction. So it's not like anything actually stopped. It just kind of changed gears a lot. And I guess the other thing to point out is that despite those arrests that were made and the cases, which, people are working on supporting those folks, it didn't, quote, stop anything per se,
Right. I think another thing that you see in sort of this particular response from the FBI is the extent to which they don't understand and don't know how to respond to decentralized, non-hierarchical, affinity-based organizing. These protests and this resistance was really, in a lot of ways, outside of their capacity to, both understand but also surveil and investigate. And so I think, in some ways, they saw that these sort of, on the ground, undercover spy teams were kind of one of the only recourses that they had to conduct surveillance, because they didn't know how else to approach what was going on.
During the Trump years, there was just all this BS about, the FBI or these liberal walking around at Whole Foods with their tote bags people, and, the DHS are the real Trump supporters. And, we had DHS troops who were from pretty hardcore units. Some of them were from Border Patrol that had been brought
Border
up to,
tactical, right.
Right. Yeah. That were went from policing, detention facilities, and they were brought up to Portland. What does that say about kind of the difference of just having those different entities on the ground? You have police, you have DHS, you have National Guard, you have FBI. What does all that mix mean? Are they all kind of working independently from each other, or?
I imagine that there's some degree of independence, but I also imagine that there's a fairly high level of coordination. What we saw, back in the, anti-globalization movement and the summit protest days was that they created these, unified joint command structures where they would have sort of one, command hierarchy and communication and logistics infrastructure that would encompass, all the various federal agencies, all the various local agencies, the National Guard, so that they could coordinate a response. And, we see that, carry over into a lot of other situations, and, the way that they use these joint terrorism task forces, these fusion centers. There's a lot more sort of interagency collaboration going on than, what there might have been 20 years ago. But that said, I think that, different agencies have different, specialties and different focuses. I think that a lot of the DHS, DHS and, sort of National Guard troops that were sent there were there as really shock troops, that they were there for, be looking tough in riot gear with lots of weapons and armor, and to brutalize people and control people and really be the iron fist. And at least from this article, it seems like the FBI, these FBI teams were there almost as security guards. in a way, that they were there to, quite plainly, like, observe and surveil activity and then report it to, the on the ground local police to make the arrests. And so that's what you see is them describing, like, see somebody breaking a window and I'm going to follow this person until there's an opportune time. I can flag this one individual to local Portland police who can swoop in and make the arrest.
Which I think a lot of people don't realize how common that is, to have FBI embedded with police at protests. And
right.
Whether or not that actually does quote anything, but just have that level of coordination where you have basically two people from different agencies.
Right. And I think the article mentioned that in one of the reports, one of the undercover FBI agents mentions seeing an undercover Homeland Security agent in the protest. And so, they know that each other are there and, like, have some way of identifying each other within this sort of larger environment.
As we saw during the rebellion, before we started recording, we made a joke about the umbrella man or whatever. There's still this lingering kind of conspiratorial notion that the authorities want to trick people into launching some massive uprising that destroys private property, because of course that's what they want. And that, the FBI embeds themselves within crowds to basically carry out illegal acts. I'm sure people have heard time and time again, like a liberal say, like, oh, there's feds in the black bloc that break the windows to make everybody look bad. But if you look at this situation, it shows, like other scenarios have shown in the past, that in reality, they're not there to carry out illegal actions like as undercover FBI agents. They're there to get people in trouble and build cases and slap you with lots of charges.
Right. I think the trope about the, like, police provocateur in the crowd is a little bit, let's say it, just a little bit tired. And I've never seen it substantiated in recent times. It's always this sort of boogeyman that exists in people's imaginations. But, we hear it most vocally from people that are sort of the more, establishment left or the more liberal sectors that really, a lot more invested in, the politics of respectability, in having control over, protest movements and social movements and the whole, social justice industry, for lack of a better term. And so, we saw various iterations of this throughout the uprising, this idea that, like, cops were pre-staging bricks at protest sites. The idea that the first person to break a window in Minneapolis was a agent provocateur of some variety, whether a right winger or a cop. All these sort of conspiracies, but just like conspiracies on the right, conspiracies on the left really, they serve these sort of unfounded conspiracy theories really serve to, maintain a status quo. And especially like in a really intense uprising like this, where it's, clearly outside of anybody's control, that, this is a, extremely diverse uprising across so many cities, so many states, so many different populations of people that are like in the streets together. And the idea that there's some like nefarious grand conspiracy across a really huge geography, across time and place and people, to instigate this somehow, it strains credibility as much as any other conspiracy theory that that you can come up with, whether from the left or the right. And so I think what we see is, these, just these attempts for people that are uncomfortable with things that are outside of their control, and they're trying desperately to regain some sort of control over it. And that's what this feels really, really indicative of. And I think, a lot of people are going to point to this article and say that, like, look, we know that there's undercover FBI that are, with the black bloc, and they're with the protesters, and, but what we see is, like, not that the FBI is there to, like, instigate the property destruction. They're there as a spying and surveillance and intelligence gathering arm. They're there to, isolate and repress people and movements in general. But it's through these tactics of surveillance and infiltration, and not through, provocation or, doing something to make the protest quote unquote look bad. As if, throwing the rock at the cops that just killed somebody is a bad look.
For sure, and there's other examples of this as well. I mean, I think I've said this before on the show, but, the case of Eric McDavid, who was entrapped by an FBI informant, Anna, before she entrapped McDavid and several other people, and kind of this, like, elaborate, like, pushing them to scheme up some, like, elaborate, action in their head, and they didn't even carry it out. They were arrested before. But she was used by the FBI at different protests, and, she would go there and basically report to them, saying, like, hey, their people are going to block, this intersection or something like that. And then they would basically use that information in real time to coordinate with the police to stop people from doing that. So, I mean, they were actively using informants to stop people from basically shutting stuff down and, advancing the protest and carrying out direct action, et cetera, not to, like, cause some sort of chaos or some illegal thing to happen so they could justify cracking down. Like, they're already cracking down, and that cracking down is wrapping people up with charges or stopping them from acting to begin with.
I think it's important to, like, study those histories, because we know what it looks like when the FBI is engaging in provocation. Because we know from, the Eric McDavid case that you talked about, we know about from, informant Brandon Darby. There was the provocateur that was involved with the, initially the Cleveland 4 case, several others, where it's these, kind of carefully orchestrated long-term operations to entrap people in these larger crimes. But the distinction there is that these are, like I said, very, very well orchestrated. They're very controlled. They're very focused. And the difference here is that, this isn't like a controlled focus operation. And I think it's important to remember that just like the people that are spreading these conspiracy theories, the FBI and the law enforcement, they're afraid of losing control. And so the idea that they would go into a crowd that's agitated, that's worked up, that is already feeling, militancy and antipathy towards the police, that they would go into this crowd and actively create a situation in which they no longer have control, in which it spins out and escalates, is, it's contrary to everything that we see from law enforcement. They are fundamentally interested in maintaining control, and instigating some sort of riot or uprising or rebellion is completely antithetical to that.
So, with all this in mind, what can we do about situations like this? Should we just basically bake into our organizing that these people are going to be there? How can we protect ourselves as best as possible from these situations?
That's a good question, and one that I don't know that I really have a good answer to. You can't stop somebody from observing something that you do in a public place, you know, there's advantages, but there's also disadvantages to anonymity in protest situations, because it allows you to protect your own identity, but you don't know, you know, if anybody's doing it right, you don't necessarily know who the person next to you is, if they're doing a decent job at protecting, you know, their own anonymity. And so it creates a space where people, with varying sort of motivations and ideas can act together in one space. And that's, you know, both the beauty and the danger of anonymity in a protest situation. You know, I do think that it is, you know, a lot of, you know, anarchists and radicals talk about like the importance of having, you know, an affinity group, or some crew, or, you know, small group of people that you're with at protests, people that, you know and trust and can make decisions with and work together with. And so that, you know, people can sort of watch out for each other. And I think this applies, you know, not just to FBI spies in the crowd, but to, you know, any sort of thing that happens, whether somebody's getting injured, whether somebody's getting, you know, attacked by, you know, right-wingers, whether somebody's getting kidnapped by unmarked paramilitary units, like what we saw in Portland. There's, you know, 1,000 different reasons why you want to be there with a small group that you trust to, you know, have each other's backs. And I think, you know, this illustrates, you know, one more really important reason for that. And that's not to say that it'll necessarily prevent anything, but it does create, you know, sort of a larger sort of zone of safety, and solidarity around each person, so that it's not just like one random individual at a crowd that can get, you know, trailed and targeted and picked out by undercovers.
You know, one of the things I think that's fascinating about this article is it mentioned COINTELPRO, and it said like the FBI was worried about it coming across that this was COINTELPRO, and I've read this in several articles from several different like FBI officials. It's kind of interesting. I actually watched a couple FBI like, I wouldn't say training videos, but they were like promoting the agency, like come work here, and they were talking about how they were trying to overcome their diversity problem.
Right. I heard a segment on NPR recently about the same issue, that they were trying to, you know, have a more diverse recruiting initiative,
right.
And acknowledging, you know, some of their quote unsavory past and how they've quote unquote moved beyond that. But I did think it was interesting that, you know, the article mentioned COINTELPRO by name, and also just the, you know, they cite that there was, you know, internal concern within the Bureau and the Department of Justice about, you know, how this sort of undercover surveillance tactics might, you know, infringe on free speech rights and, you know, other constitutionally protected activity. I thought that was interesting. And, you know, I don't know if there is like a quote unquote liberal pull within the FBI. I think that, you know, within any institution, there's going to be, you know, different perspectives on, you know, all the issues. And, you know, I think the main, you know, seeing all the different sort of power struggles within the federal government and law enforcement and things of that sort recently, you know, the one thing that's most abundantly clear is that the FBI, you know, at the end of the day, their loyalty is to, you know, to the state and to the system. But within that, you know, there can be, different perspectives about how best to serve that end. And so, you know, there are going to be probably some, more liberal perspectives on that. And, they quote, again, they quote Mike German, who used to be an FBI agent that now works for some sort of liberal civil rights think tank. But, he used to be a FBI agent. Now he makes his living giving sound bites about, what the FBI should be doing differently, to protect civil rights. And so on one hand, I was a little bit surprised to read some of that. But on the other hand, it, maybe isn't the most shocking thing. I do think that there is like a larger cultural awareness around, the FBI's past, the nature of political repression. It was just about a year ago that, box office, big movie came out about how the FBI murdered Fred Hampton. And so it wasn't that long ago that you said Fred Hampton and nobody would know who you were talking about. And now there's a, Hollywood blockbuster movie about him and how the FBI murdered him. There's been a lot more, coverage recently about, how the FBI surveilled and, tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. And so I think some of these things that the FBI had, kind of buried in their history have become a lot more, prominent and a lot more, sort of at the front of people's minds. And so, and, just the general, societal ideas about police and what the function of police is and how police, operate in our society, have, changed pretty dramatically recently. So I think they're running up against all of those things.
Well, also there's so many other agencies now. So it's like the police agencies, U.S. Marshals that went and killed Michael Reinl. I mean, right. During COINTELPRO, that would have been the FBI probably that would carry out something like that. Now you've got, these deputized cops, or like, in a situation like Standing Rock, you have, Tiger Swan or all these other private firms which are doing surveillance. Or like with the Line 3 protests, you have police getting paid literally by the pipeline company for doing, surveillance and stuff like that, which historically probably would have been carried out by the FBI, but now it's basically been privatized or shifted over sometimes to these other departments, which are more than happy to engage in, quote, illegal action or even straight up assassination if they need to.
Right. And I think, it's interesting that you brought up Michael Reinhold, because I think that there is actually a really strong parallel there between, what happened to him and what happened to Fred Hampton, because, Fred Hampton, it wasn't the FBI that pulled the trigger on Fred Hampton. It was, the Cook County Sheriffs and the Chicago PD and, local law enforcement. They were coordinating with the FBI. The intelligence, was coming from an FBI informant that was passed on. The operation was kind of being run by the FBI, but it was, local law enforcement that was pulling the trigger. And, with Michael Reinhold, it was a U.S. Marshals fugitive task force, but I think a lot of the cops that were on this task force and the cops that actually shot Michael Reinhold were local police. And so I think there is still this way that, federal law enforcement and local police interact, and in some ways kind of sometimes do each other's dirty work.
Yeah. Well, just to add on to that point, then you have the tendency of fusion centers, a lot of times pushing stuff written by the feds to basically amp up local police. I mean, we've seen this for decades.
Right.
The anarchists are going to throw piss at you during the anti-globalization movement. Or, probably the most well-known one is the information the police got in the lead up to Charlottesville that the biggest threat they were going to have was from the anti-fascists. And this was something that was leading up to Charlottesville. A lot of local police were inundated with, anti-Antifa propaganda to the point where they were, I don't want to say that they couldn't do this on their own, but it was definitely solidifying this position that they were basically there to support the right-wing people against the anti-fascists, and that's where they both, directed their violence and repression against, and, lo and behold, that's what happened. So, like you were saying, basically it's sort of this funneling down where local police are getting filled up with all this stuff from the feds, and that, lo and behold, equates to violence in the real world.
Right, and I think one of the issues going on is that, obviously, the fascists and the far right and, various police agencies, they have, similar investments into, these structures of like white supremacy and patriarchy and colonialism. But I think what they misapprise really significantly is how insurgent the right can be. And I think, we saw that a lot after January 6th, the people that were just shocked that these right-wing protesters that were carrying, thin blue line flags and Blue Lives Matter bullshit, that they could possibly be attacking police officers. Don't they support police officers? But not realizing that, what those flags actually mean is that they support white supremacy and they support the police to the extent that the police are upholding white supremacy. But as soon as the police, take some, modest incremental stand against, this right-wing insurgency, that, suddenly the police become the enemy. And, if you look at history, it's right-wingers and fascists that are the ones that are like constantly killing cops over, previous decades.
Literally just had this happen on Monday. This person in Denver.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The last person he shot was a police officer, and they shot him back and they killed him. But from my understanding, this is a person that was essentially like a Jack Donovan type. They were into Wolves of Vinland type thing. Like, look at me and my $100 hipster, get up,
right,
living in the woods. And they went on a killing spree, and the last person they shot was a female police officer, and they shot back, and he's dead now. But
and even during the uprising, like in Oakland, the federal officers that got shot and killed early in the uprising in Oakland, shot and killed by right-wing boogaloo guys, who then shot local police that attempted to apprehend them. And so it's I think that there's sort of this belief that like the right and and all of their patriotism and all of their white supremacy are somehow like loyal to the every function of the state and the police department, when what they're really loyal to is these overarching structures, and they will attack any portion of the state that they believe is sort of undermining those structures.
Yeah, just one other point on the far right. I remember I'm rereading Matthew Lyons' book on the insurgent far right, and it's kind of like I don't know if you've seen it. It's sort of just like kind of lays out different sections and like core ideological points. But one of the things that it brings up is the way historically the FBI has either interacted with or repressed or just dealt with like things like the Klan, especially during the 1960s, like during COINTELPRO. And one of the things that he talks about is like they did like outreach campaigns where they'd send out newsletters to like Klans members, like telling them, hey, don't be involved in the Klan, support the war in Vietnam or something like that. And basically the point that he makes is that they had a whole different strategy for the far right groups, trying to basically either get them not to be so violent or disengage them from the insurgent groups and trying to get them to basically turn back into the existing system if they were going to still be political. As opposed to groups like the Panthers, where they're just like, we're just going to obliterate this organization. We're going to stop it from functioning. Whether that means we're going to assassinate the key leaders, or we're going to turn people against each other, or have the police shoot up their organizational spaces or whatever. So it was a completely different mode. It wasn't like they were using the same tactics against the left, against the right. And of course we see that to this day. I mean, just even in the Pacific Northwest, I mean, even on this podcast, we were freaking out about when they were storming the Olympia state capitol.
The state house.
And then a week later they did it in DC, and it's, everybody was surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the problem, right? I think the challenge that we have is to, illustrate these double standards without trying to legitimize or redirect, the law enforcement apparatus, because, we're abolitionists, right? We don't want simply an FBI that goes after the right to the same extent that they go after the left. We're not looking for a kinder, gentler war on terrorism. The whole structure is the problem. And I think, talking about these contradictions and these double standards, it's easy to sort of pivot that into some sort of liberal reformist position. But I think it's really important to make explicit that, these problems that we're talking about, they're not sort of the product of policies that can be adjusted. They're sort of baked into the structure of these institutions. And so really, we're looking to discredit, this entire apparatus of policing rather than to adjust or redirect its functioning somehow.
We're going to be talking this week about the 1-year anniversary of January 6th, what it means. There's, of course, a lot of media that's discussing this. A lot of so-called extremism researchers are talking about this. And, of course, a lot of people on the left and anti-fascists are discussing this as well.
We were talking a bit about this before we started recording, but one of the things I've seen a lot is this. I've seen a lot of think pieces that have come out over the last week, and there are a lot of really good analysis pieces out there right now. for people to read. I mean, like, really dive into some of them. They're really good. But there's this kind of debate that's happening in these pieces where one group of people is arguing that January 6th was a sort of ending of something, right? Very specifically, usually like the ending of traditional Republican politics or something like that. And then other people are arguing that January 6th was this big beginning point, right? That it sort of emerged and now all these new things happen. And both of those perspectives are kind of limited in a sense, right? What we really saw there was we saw the culmination, on one hand, of a process which really began, right after McCarthyism, where the kind of fringe right wing had been slowly but surely gaining currency throughout this period of time. And there were ebbs and flows in this, right, obviously, but, we start to see this sort of ascendancy of the fringe during the Tea Party. And that was the culmination of multiple decades of work on the fringe right wing to even get there. And so we kind of see this culmination point in which, on one hand, there was this kind of turning over. There was this process in which, and we've talked a lot about this on this show, but the power dynamics between the sort of political class within the Republican Party and the sort of fringe right wing, which is now the kind of base politics of a lot of the constituency, the power dynamics of that flipped. And that flip had been in the offing for a while. Trumpism was definitely a huge indicator that that was going to happen, although it attempted to sort of fuse into mainstream conservatism. What we saw on January 6th was a break from that. We saw this kind of ascendant fringe right wing sort of overtake conservatism. There are other points in right wing history where this happens. But this is kind of the most severe manifestation of this, right? The most impactful. But also at the same time, that kickstarts something new. It's not just that some factions of the far right took over the Republican Party and now everybody just has their politics. It's not that simple.
And I think another thing to keep in mind is that after years of two things really happening, one is that the Trumpist section of the GOP and Trump himself calling on these insurgent forces to defend the state and specifically attack the George Floyd uprising, and also specifically attack and go after segments of the state itself. So like the Democratic Party, especially around like the mask mandates and stuff like that. I mean, as you remember, around the time there was you may have forgotten there was an entire conspiracy to kidnap the governor of Michigan,
right? That,
hold a trial and then murder her potentially at the Michigan Capitol because of the lockdowns over COVID-19. This is when, the virus first started spreading and there was the initial lockdowns. There was all these far right protests. These actually happened before, of course, the George Floyd uprising. And we can talk about the difference in terms of how the state responded and also just the trajectory of both the right-wing response to the pandemic and, of course, the popular uprising that included the George Floyd rebellion later. But again, like Trump egged this on. I mean, they were, specifically talking about and pointing the finger and targeting certain elected officials and also defending segments of the population that were going out and engaging in these sort of insurgent armed protests. And lo and behold, those same coalitions, which again were given money, and also you had like leadership in the form of people like Alex Jones working with people like Ali Alexander, who hooked up with people like Nick Fuentes. They were going around in the lead up to January 6th, holding demonstrations at different state capitals. And I want to point out, as we were saying before we started recording, I mean, big shout out to the coalitions of anti-fascists that showed up. And let's say, Atlanta, Georgia, there was mass demonstrations against these people. And also in the Twin Cities and other cities, people showed up. I don't know if you remember those big demonstrations anti-fascists had in like St. Paul, where they had the shields out and stuff like that. Again, if there would have been that response across the country to this stuff, then potentially January 6th may not have happened. Maybe those people would have said, like, you know what, it's not worth it, or I don't want to be seen with Nick Fuentes. He's a white nationalist. This is too hot for us to touch. We're going to have to go back to like just yelling on the internet or whatever we were doing before. But by and large, that didn't happen across the board, and they were allowed space to organize and rally outside of state capitals. And remember, they were doing that in many cities for weeks on end. So shout out to all the anti-fascist groups that actually mobilized quite a few people and stood off against, groups like the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys that were heavily armed and very violent. And I believe in Atlanta, I think they even beat up some people or, attacked a mutual aid thing, or they were threatening to. So, there was some real threats of violence there. And especially the Three Percenters that were involved in those altercations, they've been linked to some pretty horrific stuff, over the years as well. But, again, this didn't come out of nowhere, and there was definitely a build-up, to January 6th. So, in itself, I think, in terms of just looking at the insurgent far right and the groups that were involved in that, none of this was surprising. And again, if we look at what happened in DC just in the lead up to January 6th itself, there were these mass demonstrations, and there was also mass demonstrations in which, remember, and we've talked about this on this program before, but the Proud Boys would go out at night in DC and get drunk and try to basically destroy different murals and Black Lives Matter stuff that people had put up. And they ended up, stabbing a couple people and brutally attacking some folks, hardly even reported on in the mainstream press, or if it was kind of very much glossed over, nothing to the degree in which it's been talked about on January 6th. And again, people, especially on the left and liberals and progressives, made a very, huge break with street protests and didn't come out and counter those demonstrations. If they had, again, things might have gone differently.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of that is that, a lot of the analysis of liberals leading up to January 6th was remarkably simplistic, right? What they were portraying is they were portraying this sort of, mob of MAGA people who were slowly but surely building energy and frothing at the mouth to go do something like this. And, really all of them just were there for Donald Trump. And it's not that easy. That in reality, there was a lot going on January 6th. And it's really important for us to understand some of those nuances. And just to dive into a couple, really, really, really briefly, cause there's whole books on this kind of stuff, right? But one of the things that you saw on January 6th that was really interesting is you saw three fundamentally different approaches to the state, all manifesting in one action at the same time. And so there's always been this kind of back and forth in the far right in recent decades, right? So starting really in the 70s, and moving up through the 80s, there was this period of time in which, white supremacists, very specifically groups like the Order, like the Aryan Nation, or white Aryan resistance groups like that, declared open war on the U.S. government and did not consider themselves to be patriots, right? They would use the language of patriots. They would call Posse Comitatus people patriots or something like that. They would say that they're talking on patriot websites. But when it really got down to it, their actual literature that they were writing was openly talking about warfare with the U.S. state and how patriotism was a form of, sort of not fighting hard enough, right? At the same time, they were working with groups that were seeing themselves as sort of groups that were trying to sort of defend the republic, right? When you start to get into the militia movement era in the late 80s through the 90s and into now, you see those two things kind of existing side by side, but on the fringe. What's really different on January 6th is you saw three completely different approaches to this. You had white nationalists and white separatists who were there to fight the government, right? To fight the U.S. government, and saw this as an attack on the U.S. government the same way that Oklahoma City was. You had your, generic MAGA supporters who were comically patriotic, right? Patriotic to the point of parody, sort of absurdly so. But not necessarily in the sense of not necessarily in the sense of tearing the state down to save it, but in the sense of really attaching a notion of Americanism to a specific person and trying to make sure that person stayed in power. But then you had a whole third group of people. And these were the QAnon types, conspiracy theorists, right? They were enmeshed in this worldview going into January 6th, in which what was going to happen there, according to them, and shockingly enough, what we have recently found out was actually under discussion in the actual White House, was that Trump was going to declare a state of insurrection and send in the military and confiscate the voting machines and invalidate the election. And they saw that as the beginning of some sort of weird MAGA utopia where Trump was going to unmask the pedophiles and blah, 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 blah. And that notion is sort of hyper-American to the point of advocating openly dictatorship. So like MAGA people now are doing that. But at the time, they just started dipping their toes into sort of overtly anti-democratic narratives, right? A whole year later, that has all changed now. But the thing that really emerged on that day was you saw three completely different approaches to the U.S. state and the idea of the U.S. political project merge around a common cause, right? So for like white separatists and white nationalists and white power people, Trump is a means to an end. Right. And they talk about him that way. David Duke talks about him that way, for example. Right. And so they're willing to defend Trump because he's a means to an end. The thing is, every single time the right wing has done this, and this is not the first time the right wing has done this, as I mentioned before, it's the first time that this became ascendant to the point of being able to dominate the inertia of right wing politics in general. When that happened, they're coming into conflict with a traditional conservatism that none of those tendencies are a part of. And so you're seeing this moment in which they look like they're at their moment of greatest strength. And in some ways that's true. But at the same time, the fissures that exist as a result of that common cause are still there. And we're starting to see that friction start to happen because the common cause isn't present anymore.
Yeah, and also, another point, like the degree in which they have to justify, as you said, kind of coming to that end goal of like the anti-democratic analysis. We basically got to seize power in order to save America or stop the Great Replacement or stop the evil cabal. I mean, in order to get to that point, they basically have to say that the vast majority of the country now is somehow an part of the evil communist conspiracy. Because, I mean, if they're literally at the point where they're saying, quote, all the Democrats, so basically all the people that aren't, hardcore Trump supporters are somehow in on this vast conspiracy or the problem. I mean, that's a problem in terms of numbers. And I think in reality, for me, that's what makes a lot of this scary, because if you're at a point where certain people within the Pentagon or within the military we're literally about to flip the switch for Trump on January 6th and do things like say, hey, we're not going to send in the National Guard to go after you. In fact, we're going to support you and even go after any sort of counter protesters that may arise.
Well, and again, to put this stuff in historical context, and I keep doing this, I keep bringing this back to history, because I think that that's actually what's lacking in the discussion right now. People want to talk about Trumpism, and they want to talk about, MAGA political culture, and they want to talk about people committing a bunch of felonies on camera on January 6th, right? That's really the historical lens in which a lot of this analysis is happening. It's happening in a lens that started in 2016 and ended on January 6th. The reality is that this idea that really all of your political enemies are part of a secret conspiracy to enact some sort of, it's usually communist sort of political revolution or political coup. That's a position that's been held in the right wing for a really, really long time. I mean, that's the position that animated McCarthyism. However, Joseph McCarthy never really had majority support in the Republican Party for the House Un-American Activities Committee. He sort of was able to do it as a politician that had some leverage, but the historical record that's coming out now is showing that even at the time, a lot of people in the Republican Party were really uneasy about what was happening. The people that were holding that position, though, were like the Young Patriots, which were a right-wing militia, and the John Birch Society. Now, to give you context about the role of the John Birch Society in Republican politics, or their position within Republican politics, in the 1980s, William F. Buckley and Ronald Reagan very intentionally purged all of the John Birch Society members out of the Republican Party because they thought that they were fringe wingnuts. Okay, this is William F. Buckley, the godfather of contemporary conservatism, and Ronald Reagan, who the dead Kennedys were making albums about calling him a Nazi. And the John Birch Society was too far out there for him.
Even Richard Nixon would say things disparagingly against the John Birch Society.
Yeah, Nixon was a conspiracy theorist, right?
There was definitely a line, which, isn't to say that historically there haven't been people that have run for office under the Republican ticket, or especially people like George Wallace, that have been deeply tied to either the KKK or even like early National Socialist neo-Nazi groups, because that definitely was true.
Yeah, but it was never the predominant tendency. And I think that this is the thing that's really shifted, right? So in Republican politics and conservative politics and in liberal politics, there was always this sort of assumption that persisted up until very recently, I think. And I think during the Trump era sort of persisted as this idea that this state is normal, like the state of things is normal, in which conservatives and liberals within the political mainstream saw themselves as working towards a common goal, right? They might have had different ideas of what that looked like. They might have had different ideas about how to get there. But at the end of the day, they were all trying to exalt the American political project, right? They were trying to sort of improve it, make it better, manifest and continue this kind of utopian vision, right? And in that, we're unified. And really that unification is necessary, or that myth of unification is necessary for things like liberal democracy to function. Because if we really look at how liberal democracies function traditionally, they function by taking political conflict and shoving it into a parliamentary structure as a way of sort of declawing it, right? And allowing that conflict to occur, but within a really measured sort of context. What happened during Trumpism is we started seeing this, I think with conservatives, some of them, or an increasing number, it started this trajectory under Obama. But when you start to get into Trump, you start to see a breakdown of that assumed alliance, right? You start to see liberals and conservatives in the mainstream going after each other in really absolutist terms. And it's not just conservatives. I mean, conservatives are absolutely comfortable now talking about dictatorships and, killing all the commies or whatever.
This kind of squares up with the rhetoric, because with, the John Birch Society, it was always like, oh, desegregation and civil rights is a Trojan horse for communism and socialism. And that's why we've got to push back against it. Now the rhetoric is that, the communists have taken over. The deep state is here. It controls everything. Wokeness is this dictatorial regime which controls all our lives. I mean, if you're not in the cult, it sounds ridiculous, but the way that they describe kind of what they're up against, it seems to be in even more kind of extreme terms.
Yeah, well, narratives have existed in the right wing like that for a while. I mean, the religious right, for example, you used to always talk about American society is run by degenerates who we have to sort of either Christianize or eliminate through police force, right? I mean, the whole anti-abortion movement is grounded in that sort of idea. However, when you started talking to politicians like someone like Lindsey Graham, or even someone like Newt Gingrich, right? Back in the day, they would all say, "Oh yeah, but we're all still Americans. We might disagree, but we're all here for the same reason," right? That mentality does not exist anymore. January 6th was a physical manifestation of the destruction of that mentality. It's no longer about the sort of mythology of liberal democracy in which, actual political conflict actually happens within parliamentary structures. In reality, what we're seeing that all of those niceties, all of those assumptions of liberal democracy were exactly what I think a lot of people feared that they were, which is completely toothless, random cultural agreements that actually have zero limiting force, right? The basic reality is that liberal democracy is a fairy tale. It's a nice fiction. But it's an attempt to make the state not the state. It's an attempt to make politics not conflict. It's an attempt to take statism and not make it a structure of authoritarian impositions of sovereignty. But it always is that. And so when we're locked in these kinds of conflicts, like we're seeing now, on some level, it's the kind of stripping away of the illusion, right? That under the surface, this is what's happening in a lot of cases, right? But it's being sort of couched in this language of discursive nicety. That all went away. And it's been a long trajectory to get there, in which the idea that that wasn't true built and built and built and built and built within the right wing for many, many, many years. And now it's gone from this fringe of John Birch Society people to what I would argue is the mainstream position in the right wing movement right now. That every single person that is not a part of their political faction or whatever, including other people that identify the same way, are not just the enemy, but they're an enemy that's so dangerous that they're an existential threat and needs to be eliminated. That's the danger here. And this is where we can really start to see both the moment in which this tendency has the possibility of, once again, confining itself to the fringe, right? Even people that voted for Trump, not all of them are super down with the anti-democratic thing. And that position is, though very loud, definitely not held by everybody. So we're watching some of that, but at the same time, we're kind of watching this sort of ascendancy of a political mentality, which is, for conservatives, a mentality of open warfare. While for liberals, they're sitting there saying, yeah, but that's just not normality. What we really need is normality, which is just the reestablishment of the illusions of liberal democracy, right? Really, at the end of the day, the state's the state, and the idea that we can sort of impose a vision of the world on others through state violence, that is the kind of standard position in political modernity. But so the struggle then becomes, the struggle over the state becomes this struggle which has these really immediate material implications. Even though liberals are still trying to engage this from this purely conceptual discursive place, that's not where we're at anymore. I would say anti-fascists, we've been arguing this for a long time, right? The conflict against fascism is not predominantly a conflict of ideas. It is a thing that manifests physically in the streets, because fascism at the end of the day is just police force. And so it's always this material conflict. Liberals aren't existing in that world right now. And you're starting to see more and more and more of them start to get there. But there's still this idea that persists for some reason after a whole year of the Biden administration. There's still this idea that January 6th was an anomaly at the tail end of a bunch of anomalies, and all we need to do is get back to what normal is. The reality is we are far gone from that point, if that ever existed to begin with.
Yeah, and it seems like the huge impasse is that the system seems unwilling to really put powerful and rich people, on trial or get them in trouble.
Yeah.
Why are the people that organized this thing not in jail? Why is Trump not in jail right now? Well, I think it's obvious because they're rich and powerful people. And the same reason they're not going to face any repercussions is the same reason that their whole lives have been one of wealth and privilege, and they've gotten away with, everything from not paying taxes to hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein for years. History will look back on January 6th much in the same way we look back now at the end of the Confederacy, which is essentially the state tried to basically reabsorb those local elite institutions back into its governing apparatus, as opposed to hold people, quote, accountable or, try them for crimes or whatever. I don't think we're going to really see that. I think we're going to see a lot of like Proud Boys and lower level people going away for, a couple months or a couple years for like property destruction or probably like, attacking cops and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like the people that really had their fingers on the trigger and were really kind of the intermediaries between the state, Trump, and sort of these far right forces, I don't think so at all. And that just sets the stage for this thing to happen again. There was recently a Washington Post op-ed that was written by 3 retired generals where it talked about there should be war games by the Pentagon and the state should get ready for another attempted insurrection. And kind of the scenario that they laid out was that they see a possibility in which either people that were appointed by Trump or that are loyal to him or another Trumpian candidate basically contest the election.
I think what's really fascinating about these kinds of takes, and there's like a bunch of takes like this, right? These are also all over the media right now. People writing these kind of arm flappy alarmists, like the right wing's going to take over everything and kill your children, sort of pieces. And like I find one thing in common with all of them. And that is that every single one of these pieces assumes that power flows from the federal government. It assumes a centralized model of political power. I mean, this piece written by these generals starts to break that down a bit and starts to talk about what happens when that breaks down. But it's still assuming that that's the standard sort of lens in which this stuff is viewed through. The reality is that those institutions definitely exist, in the sense that on paper and sort of organizationally, there are hierarchies and things like that. However, you have to always remember something, and this is really crucial for us. Power doesn't operate in Washington, D.C. I want to just pose a sort of hypothetical, right? So let's say that there were no police. 435 people can gather in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. and write as many documents as they want. And they all mean literally nothing until a cop picks up a gun and shoves it in your face and tells you have to listen, right? That sort of structure of power operates incredibly immediately and remarkably materially. And so one of the things that is missing in all of these articles, and one of the things I think is missing in a lot of the sort of analysis of what would have happened if January 6th would have gone a different way, or what's going to happen in 2024, is that there's no people in these analyses, right? There's kind of a group of pro-Trump people. There's the military as an object. There's the police as an object. There's protesters as an object, but no one talked about what happens on a street corner in Chicago when this goes down. Because the answer is not a caravan of right-wing militia people roll through Chicago untouched and take control of the city. That's not going to be what happens here.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show.
And so we all need to start to really think about these questions on this really grounded material level, right? Again, this is the just overwhelming importance of people divesting themselves from these kind of notions of politics which exist written down in documents and out of social nicety. That's not really politics. And that no longer functions. And it never did function. It was always something which covered up more profound conflicts. That's one of the reasons why we're still struggling with the legacy of colonialism in the United States. So we have this reality of politics. And then we have this mentality of politics. And a lot of the people that are freaking out about January 6th are lost into this mentality of politics. What they're not doing is they're not then flipping that lens, kind of like what we've been doing on this show, flipping that lens and going, this is what Steve Bannon's doing. This is what that means infrastructurally. This is how he's going to try and leverage that. This is what this person's saying. This is how that interacts with that. We need to start thinking about what the right wing is doing on that level. We need to start arraying these forces in front of us and starting to look at what they are, how they function, not what they are as a conceptual entity, but how they manifest logistically and what that looks like in order to be able to think about what this era of politics, which I think for a lot of anarchists has been the case forever. But for a lot of other people, they're just starting to see this. We all have to come to terms with the fact that politics is not primarily right now necessarily about a debate about ideas. There is no marketplace of ideas. There never was. But especially right now, that's really obvious. It's all broken down into what politics really is, which is a conflict over the conditions of living, right? That's what's at stake now. And what's happening in the right wing is that the right wing is actually, shockingly, putting together what sound like coherent strategies. They would never function. They're still based in the notion that power flows from DC. The entirety of January 6th was grounded in the idea that power exists in buildings. But when you're belaboring that understanding of power, things like January 6th make a lot of sense. Things like talking about what happens if part of the military changes sides and how really it's going to be about a conflict of the breakdown of state institutions makes sense. But in reality, we have to really think about how power functions, where we are in the places that we're at. And I know where I'm at. I'm not worried about right-wing militias rolling through my streets. They would never make it through the city limits. And that's the reality for a lot of us. And so we're not looking at a situation, I think, realistically, in which January 6th is foreshadowing for some right-wing seizure of power. Like, I forget what outlet it was in, but today I came across an article, and I skimmed it, but it was an article talking about how some military theorist is predicting that we're going to be in a right-wing dictatorship by 2030. And of course, it was all about, like, MAGA people are going to steal the 2024 election, and blah, blah, blah. And it all assumed that that was just going to happen without anyone pushing back on anything. Right? The basic reality of the situation is that if they would have, say, stayed in the Capitol, that would have meant literally nothing. They could have just gone to the Hart office building across the street and voted there. It literally means nothing. Right? Until they're doing things like what's happening in Kazakhstan right now, where people are running around burning government buildings to the ground. Until that happens, this talk of right-wing dictatorship is probably a little premature. However, that does not mean the right wing is not a huge, massive threat. It doesn't mean that this ascendancy of these fringe narratives into the mainstream of the right wing isn't super dangerous. It doesn't also mean that people aren't going to get hurt. Like, there is a reality that people are going to get hurt in this process. And we need to be able to see what's in front of us, to be able to understand how to stop ourselves from being that person, essentially.
We're going to continue to see kind of this low boil of far-right violence, whether it's like the recent shooting in Denver or continued targeting of like Planned Parenthood buildings and mosques and everything to, Patriot Front marching around in the streets. We're going to continue to see all that. Because there's a big sea for them to swim in and get noticed. And right now, those groups all have a reason to stick together and promote each other. I mean, like Steve Bannon's channel is literally promoting Patriot Front, one of the groups that marched in Charlottesville. Those kind of like old walls are breaking down. I mean, you have Republicans like Gozar and like some other folks that are openly promoting Fuentes pretty regularly. And there's no longer those kind of like, very hard dividing lines, which to me, that's also very scary as well. And Fuentes, if you listen to him, I mean, they're very clear that they are dragging those folks further and further to the right. I think it's important, again, for us to talk about like, so then what does our side do in response? And I think that we have to really, again, not just counter the far right. We have to build a vibrant, engaging counter movement that's engaging people on the ground and actually talking about the reality of things happening, which is climate change, which is the pandemic, which is massive wealth and racial inequality, which is people dying by hundreds of thousands so people on Wall Street can get rich. I mean, that's what's really going on, not this culture war crap. The big donors and the corporate backers of the Republican Party are happy for that to happen because they don't want people to get any big ideas about what's really screwing things up. And they're more than happy to let this insurgent far-right forces kind of like run amok and push this culture war narrative.
Yeah, and so I think that there's a big question that's emerging, right? Where you have, say, the mainstream, quote-unquote mainstream of the Republican Party is very clearly using this kind of what used to be a fringe element and is now kind of a really active core part of right-wing kind of political culture. They're definitely using these people as culture warriors, right? They're keeping them in a constant state of upsettedness. They're making them angry all the time. They're pushing these kind of vague conspiracy theories all the time, constantly. And they're creating this sense of existential threat. And that's to really keep these people kind of moving all the time. Again, this is all a strategy to compensate for the fact that, well, the Republicans are a political minority, like a pretty dramatic minority at this point. And that is increasingly becoming true. And so they need to amplify and escalate and accelerate what they're feeding to this group of people that is largely the energy of the right-wing movement right now. But at the same time, a lot of the people that are behind the constituent groups of that MAGA political culture, or people that are just off to the side of that, people like Nick Fuentes, they're using these people as a way to kind of ride the wave up into a more mainstream position. At some point that comes to a head, though. At some point that becomes a power struggle. At some point, someone from some right-wing organization does something super heinous, and all of a sudden, there's a debate within right-wing circles about whether or not attacking that government building was okay or not. Because this happened after Oklahoma City. We were talking about this before we were recording, but, around Oklahoma City, when that happened, there was a huge split in the fringe right wing where people who considered themselves patriots distanced themselves really dramatically from people that they considered to be terrorists. And every single time that the right wing starts to build this sort of space in which a common cause kind of levels all differences, something like that ultimately happens, right? The big question is not if something like that's going to happen. The big question is when. I have no doubts in my mind that there are people out there right now that are, if not actively planning, at least really thinking hard about planning, an action which is going to result in mass casualties. And very likely that action will target the federal government. Where I'm starting to see on survivalist boards and stuff like that I keep an eye on, I'm starting to see a rise of the same rhetoric that you heard in the mid-90s. Amongst that fringe element. You're starting to hear this rhetoric of total war. You're starting to hear this rhetoric of, well, maybe we can just poison the water supply to New York City, that kind of stuff.
And that's basically based off of people being, quote, angry over mandates and masks and vaccines, or?
Well, all of it is an attempt to replicate what happened in the Turner Diaries, right? You're seeing this kind of really fringe element start to pick up this idea that they just have support. And that inertia is what led to the storming of the State House in Oregon and the storming of the State House in Michigan and January 6th, was that feeling of inertia. So some group of people is going to go, well, if we've got support for January 6th, then we've got support for, there was a militia group in Kansas that got arrested 6 or 7 years ago because they were planning on blowing up an apartment building full of Somali refugees.
Right. Those are people that were 3%ers.
Yeah, they were 3%ers. So eventually someone's going to do something like that, unfortunately. And it's when those things happen that we will really see how strong this kind of temporary coalition amongst the right wing is. I think that if something like that happens, we're going to watch a lot of splits happen. We're going to watch people like Nick Fuentes end up in really weird situations where their constituency, like Nick Fuentes' constituency, definitely comes out of white nationalism. A lot of them do. And they're not necessarily loyal patriots. But yet he is putting forward this image of being that way, right? At some point, those contradictions come to a head. At some point, someone on the right wing does something that can't be excused away. And at some point, the common cause disappears, right? One of the best articles I read this week is what happens if Trump drops dead before 2024, which is absolutely possible, right? He is not particularly healthy and he's almost 80 years old, right? At that point, the common cause disappears unless the right wing can create a new common cause. And so this is where we need to really pay attention to this rhetoric around dictatorship and this rhetoric around secession, right? Both of which are flip sides of the same coin. These are both approaches to a problem of what happens when you cannot impose your will on others. How do you then get to the point where you can impose your will on others? At the point in which the conservative movement or the right wing becomes grounded in that question, as opposed to past questions about things like what is conservatism or things like that, that's the point in which things become really dangerous. It doesn't mean that they're going to win. It doesn't mean we're all going to end up in prison camps. It doesn't mean that we need to freak out and sort of act in these incredibly anxious ways. It does mean we need to be paying really close attention to what's being said and who's saying it and what the funding networks behind that are. And so I really encourage everyone here, January 6th commission, whatever, it's a congressional commission, but some of the data that they're releasing is really awesome. And it's allowing us to gain a glimpse, not just into the idea that the common cause has, sort of level differences on the right, but more what that logistically means. Where does Alex Jones exist in this structure? Where do mainstream political action committees exist in this structure? Where are funders like the Koch brothers in this structure, right? Like, how does that all work? And we're starting to gain glimpses into that. And we're starting to see really interesting things. Like, for example, the Koch brothers foundation funds white nationalist organizations, which they swear up and down they never would do. But not only do they fund them, they're the single biggest funder for VDARE, right? We're starting to see stuff like that. When things like that become public, you start to watch fissures happen. And so we need to be really strategic in what information we're getting, what we're paying attention to, and how we're using it, right? You know, we talked a lot about how there's this tendency to get information, dump it on the internet right away. That's not what needs to be happening here. This isn't about franticness. This is about careful study, right? We need to get over this idea that the right wing is trying to engage in a battle of ideas. They're not. That has nothing to do with what's going on now. This is a purely material conflict for them. And it's taken on a kind of militaristic structure, right? That's the thing we have to be paying attention to, because that's the precursor for much more dangerous things to be happening here. One of the biggest failures of, you know, anti-fascist work really happened after the collapse of the movements of the late 60s and early 70s, before the rise of groups like the Order in the early 80s. That there was a period of time in which there were organizations that were out there trying to counter the far right, or even just pay attention to them, but they weren't very numerous. And people took their eye off what was going on. They stopped paying attention to it, and they started sort of engaging it as this, like, well, those are dumb racists. A lot of Americans are still in that place right now. And as anarchists, we need to get very far away from that position. This is not about uneducated conspiracy theorists running around doing stuff because their pastor told them to. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that there are legitimate grievances that people have that are being manipulated by the right wing and being used to level differences to be able to create an inertia like this. And it's happening very intentionally. And it's being done by people that are very smart and very well funded, right? When we sit there and write these people off as conspiracy theorists and wingnuts and uneducated, we lose the ability to take them seriously. And the reality is that the position we should really be taking here, the kind of point of departure that we need to be operating from, is not any of the positions that are being put forward as the main positions right now, which are everything's bad and we're all going to die in right-wing dictatorship, or, you know, we're all just in a battle of ideas, right? Neither of those positions make any sense. The reality is that we exist somewhere in the middle here, where the right wing is engaged in a material conflict that they view as a militaristic material conflict. They're never going to seize power, at least not in the near future, in any kind of believable reality. The question becomes how much damage gets done in their attempt to do so. That's what we really need to be paying attention to. Because we might end up in a situation in which this gets very bad. And we're watching a rise in hate crimes. And we're watching a rise in organizational levels and logistical capacity in these organizations right now. We're watching people like Josh Hawley start to pick up their narratives and push them forward very directly in really mainstream sort of venues. All of that is super dangerous, right? That's what we need to take away from January 6th. Not that we're all going to end up in prison camps and Donald Trump's going to be our dictator. What we need to take away from January 6th is that that is what the right wing will attempt to do. And in their failure, how much damage are they going to cause? And how many people are going to get hurt in the process, right? That's what we really need to be taking out of that. We have to remember we are the best counterbalance to an attempt to seize power. By we, I mean us that are on the streets, right? Not just anarchists, but all of the people who are willing to, like, stand up against the cops in the streets. We are the people that ultimately push back coups. If you really look at how coup attempts fail, if you really look at how seizures of power fail, they either fail really early on, or they fail because people hit the streets and prevent them from being successful. That's the situation that we're really looking at potentially having to confront, is one in which we have to be the ones that prevent it from happening. I have no doubt that that will happen, that we'll be successful in that. But again, we need to essentially start to get ready for a fight. The right wing is already there. And I think a lot of anarchists are already there. And it's not a question of frontal clashes between us and Nazis. It is now a much more complicated question about how power functions, where it functions, through whom it flows, and what that looks like in relation to really fringe, dangerous sort of people and organizations. That's the thing we need to be paying attention to right now.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.